In the early 1960s, South Korea was one of the poorest countries in Asia, with a per capita income similar to that of some African countries. After enduring the horrific Japanese occupation, where its women even resorted to prostitution to survive, and a terrible war with its northern neighbors, where they were on the verge of becoming a communist regime, it seemed impossible for South Korea to develop and become one of the richest countries in the world. In recent years, it has achieved a per capita income higher than that of its Japanese tormentors and that of European countries like Spain and Poland, with a per capita GDP of more than $54,000 per year. But how did it achieve this in just over 60 years? Was its model similar to that of China, or did it rather seek to follow the model successfully implemented in Poland? Let's review its history to understand the keys to its success, which led it to become one of the 10 countries in the world with the most exports, with more than $630 billion exported the previous year. This story needs to be told even going back to the previous century. Until the end of World War II, Korea was dominated by Japan between 1910 and 1945. The Japanese took advantage of cheap Korean labor to set up their factories. The Japanese came to control 53% of Korean land, which led many Koreans to become tenants on their own land, forced to even pay more than a harvest as rent. The high debts caused many of the workers' daughters, or even their wives, to be forced into prostitution in dives to satisfy the Japanese soldiers and raise money to pay the high taxes. It is estimated that more than 200,000 women were forced into sex work during the occupation period. During this period, Koreans lost fundamental rights, such as freedom of association and expression, and were forced to receive Japanese language instruction over their own language. It is estimated that nearly 8 million Koreans during this period were forced into factory labor or forced into service as soldiers. While the establishment of factories in Korea by the Japanese can be considered the beginning of the country's industrialization, the reality is that the Japanese were not seeking Korea's development, but rather the exploitation of its cheap, or in some cases, enslaved labor. Therefore, Korean workers did not receive sufficient education to operate these factories after the Japanese left in 1945. After Japan's defeat and withdrawal from Korea, during the transition, some companies were transferred through a bilateral agreement between Japan and Korea, while others were sold privately. When Japan was attacked in 1945 with the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, its weakness was also exploited by the Soviet Union. On August 8, 1945, they declared war on Japan, and just one day later attacked the Korean peninsula from the north. The Americans quickly became alert and sent troops to Busan in southern Korea, quickly realizing that the Soviets wanted to take advantage of Japan's weakness to gain strategic control of the Korean peninsula. On August 10, 1945, when Japan's surrender was being planned, the United States War Department decided that the 38th parallel would be the defensive boundary between the Soviets and the Americans. Despite a tense atmosphere, the Soviet Union respected the decision and ordered troops not to cross the boundary established by the Americans. Initially, Stalin recognized Japan's surrender, but was unclear about the division of the Korean peninsula. Both armies advanced rapidly, and the Soviet Red Army entered the city of Pyongyang, establishing a military government north of the 38th parallel. Meanwhile, the American army was not far behind, and its forces reached the south on September 8th, also establishing a military government in South Korea, in the city of Seoul. Tensions after the end of World War II grew increasingly intense, and both sides sought political supporters in each of the two Koreas. In 1948, the first democratic elections were held, and Syngman Rhee was elected president, seeking to replace the United States military occupation. On the other side of North Korea, on September 9, 1948, Kim Il-sung was declared prime minister, and an agreement was reached with the Soviet Red Army to leave the country by December 1948. The problem arose because both governments declared themselves presidents of both Koreas. Kim Il-sung sought military support from Stalin's Moscow and Mao Zedong's China to achieve reunification. On the other side, President Syngman Rhee had intentions of dominating the North, since, among other reasons, that was where almost all the South's electricity was generated. In June 1950, the Korean War began with the invasion of South Korea under the orders of Kim Il-sung, who expected a short conflict, as his troops had an advantage in numbers and weapons, and the training provided by the Soviets. But contrary to expectations, the United Nations, led by the United States, decided to support South Korea, drawing the Korean Peninsula into the bloodiest and cruelest war in its history. It is estimated that more than 3 million soldiers and civilians on both sides died in a conflict that lasted more than 3 years. Stalin's death paved the way for an agreement in July 1953, which recognized Korea as divided in two. South Korea signed a defense treaty with the United States to guarantee military support, and the United States even established nuclear weapons bases in 1958. One of the key leaders was Lee Sung-man, who was elected president in 1948 and re-elected in 1956. His closeness to the Americans allowed him to raise capital for the reconstruction of the country. However, during this period, the country was mired in highly corrupt management, which led to the embezzlement of funds and caused underdevelopment to continue for another decade. But a portion of these resources went to certain families who managed to forge the industrial conglomerates that would help the economy recover, although their closeness to corrupt political classes is still a matter of investigation. Little by little, the country sought to create an import-substituting industrialization model, where the government sought to support these companies with subsidies and tax reductions in an attempt to make South Korean companies and products competitive enough to be exported. However, high levels of corruption and economic stagnation led to student protests in 1960. To give an idea of the government's economic failure, the GDP per capita was less than $200, very close to that of its northern neighbors, and growth had stagnated for almost a decade. The protests led to the resignation of President Lee Sung-man, but the country entered a period of political and economic instability, with the increasing influence of the military in politics. In 1961, Park Jong-hee, with the help and support of the military under Kim Jong-pil, successfully staged a coup d'etat, arriving in power for the next 18 years. This period is known by some as the beginning of the so-called Miracle on the Han River. Park established an authoritarian regime where, while the government controlled the economy, it allowed the development and growth of large economic conglomerates. But without a doubt, one of Park's greatest achievements was his appointment of a select group of top-level economists who made up the so-called Economic Planning Board. Among the decisions of the Park government and the Hunna was the reconstruction of facilities that had fallen into deplorable condition due to the intense war. A comprehensive network of highways and railways was also developed to connect the cities that were industrial centers. The construction of major power plants was also promoted. The government also established good relations with the so-called chaebol, or large industrial conglomerates, reaching agreements for the approval of government loans to companies that were successful in exporting and attracting foreign investment. These agreements were stipulated in the Loan Repayment Guarantee Act of 1962. Although the United States did not recognize the Park regime, Dictator Park did maintain a good relationship with the U.S. military, thereby maintaining the support of his former military and economic allies. The model implemented by Park is known as guided capitalism, which promoted the creation of private companies. But the government could make key decisions in the most important industries. The plan also included the development of the agro-industrial sector, as well as the massive hiring of unemployed labor for the development of roads and infrastructure. Furthermore, Korean culture was revived, promoting the reaffirmation of its identity as an independent country, with nuances that distanced it from Japanese and Soviet impositions. However, the plan initially did not achieve its objectives as expected. Initially, inflation soared, as the country had borrowed at excessively high rates and needed capital to finance its transformation. The government allowed exporting companies to use their resources to also import products. This measure increased the availability of basic consumer goods to control the inflationary surge that was becoming a problem for the population. Additionally, the textile industry benefited from the importation of inputs at low prices. While Park sought to make heavy industry the driving force for economic growth, it was the textile industry that drove industrial development. Companies like Daewoo even began in that sector, achieving rapid growth that later allowed them to enter other sectors. Park's good relations with the Americans allowed him to sign exclusive contracts for support in construction of infrastructure and military support in the Vietnam War. One of the large conglomerates that benefited from these agreements was Hyundai, which was instrumental in the construction of infrastructure for military use, where the company also received knowledge transfers from American military engineers. This knowledge transfer allowed it to later leverage these lessons learned in the heavy industry sector. By the mid-1960s, the industry had already taken off, growing at rates close to 10% annually. By the early 1970s, Park was achieving an increase in per capita income, or GDP per capita, with good annual growth rates. However, after winning the elections in 1971, Park faced a tremendous wave of protests, which led him to push through a series of political and social reforms to improve education, promote gender equality, and modernize the countryside. The New Villages movement was then promulgated, in which communities themselves would manage the development of their region's infrastructure. In the education sector, more science and engineering faculties were opened in high-quality public education, and the creation of research institutes was promoted. The objective was to improve the skill levels of the working-class population in order to secure the human talent that would help continue the growth of the industry that was already beginning to flourish. By the 1970s, three giant industrial conglomerates, known as chaebols, were consolidated: Hyundai, Samsung, and Lucky, later known as LG. These conglomerates managed to transform into other sectors of heavy industry, such as shipbuilding. Park achieved his goal of developing a heavy industry with export capacity. Hyundai was one of the companies that achieved the best results, and even today it is considered one of the largest shipbuilding companies in the world. But political tensions increased due to Park's prolonged presidency. Although he was elected, he was accused of failing to respond to the kidnapping of the main opposition leader, Kim Dae-jung, who was even at risk of assassination. Tensions escalated, and the United States threatened to terminate trade relations if the situation was not brought under democratic control. However, Park decided to impose martial law and authoritarianly intervene in the decisions of the Economic Planning Board, prioritizing agricultural and aquaculture development. Later, in 1973, efforts were made to boost the chemical and heavy industries, but unlike in previous years, board members held increasingly less sway, and decisions were made authoritarianly by Park. These measures led to a tremendous concentration of economic power in a few, and only the largest companies, as the government gave incentives to companies that met certain targets. But sometimes the benefits actually went to companies where Park had close friends. But Park's mismanagement led to small businesses facing serious difficulties in growing, and of the heavy industry companies that benefited, only POSCO was successful. The strategy had a key positive component: the plan to promote the automotive industry, aiming to reach production of 500,000 vehicles by 1980. In that effort, Kia managed to produce the Brisa model with a Japanese Mazda engine, but it was Hyundai that managed to design and manufacture the first 100% Korean automobile with the Pony model. However, behind this success was the also Japanese Mitsubishi, which was instrumental in the construction of Hyundai's assembly plant in Ulsan. Hyundai's Pony model proved to be reliable and began to be exported, especially to Latin America and the Middle East, promoting long-awaited exports. The inflow of foreign currency was complemented by the influx of euros and dollars from citizens who went to work in other countries in trades such as nursing and mining. By 1976, government subsidies were being sought to strengthen the steel, naval engineering, and heavy machinery sectors, achieving tremendous annual economic growth, exceeding 7% in some years. But public discontent increased due to the concentration of wealth in a few companies and slower economic growth. In 1979, the dictatorship experienced its most difficult moment when Park was assassinated in October by a member of his own government. A period of political instability began. Despite all the criticism of dictator Park's government, he managed to increase exports from 2% of GDP in 1962 to 30% in 1980. Chun Doo-hwan took power after running as the sole candidate. During his term, South Korea strengthened its relationship with the United States. During his tenure, until 1987, Chun sought to stabilize the economy, in addition to liberalizing it by privatizing a large number of banks and promoting private ownership of the productive sector. Korea once again returned to a period of high economic growth, with high levels of investment in industry and production, and the development of research and development. During this period, a large number of engineers, scientists, and industrial workers were trained who formed the basis of successful industries in the following years. From that moment on, large companies consolidated their position to compete in the automotive, shipbuilding, chemical, and appliance manufacturing sectors. Exports and the economy grew so much that per capita GDP rose from $10,000 in 1994 to $30,000 in 2017. Economic growth continued in recent years, reaching a per capita GDP of $43,000, surpassing Spain's $42,000. The success of promoting exports was such that by 2023, it would reach $632 billion, making it the ninth largest exporting economy in the world, surpassing countries that historically had stronger economies, such as the United Kingdom, or more populous countries, such as India. For some analysts, however, behind the recent success of the Korean economy lies the influence of Confucianism, which promotes order, the importance of collective well-being, respect for hierarchies, and discipline. Remember that in the video description, you will find a link to the best course to learn technical and fundamental analysis for investing in stocks. There is also a link to the best platform for buying stocks on the stock exchange, regulated in the United States. If you enjoyed the video, give us a like, subscribe to the channel, and share the content.